If you've lived in upstate New York most of your life, there's a good chance you've passed places where entire communities once lived without ever realizing it. Across this region are towns that vanished, communities that ended up underwater, and places tied to stories that sound too unbelievable to be true. These are 13 ghost towns in upstate New York, and number 1 will blow your mind. Number 13, Tahawus, New York. Tahawus was abandoned twice, once in 1856 when the iron was too contaminated to smelt profitably, and once in 1989 when the titanium was exhausted. The thing that ruined the first mine made the second one possible. And in between, a vice president of the United States was hiking nearby when he learned the president was dying, and made a midnight horseback ride through the Adirondack forest that ended with him arriving as president. Archibald McIntyre and David Henderson found iron ore on the upper Hudson River in 1826 and built a complete ironworks community. A blast furnace, houses, a school, a church, a boarding house that slept 100 people. The ore contained titanium dioxide that 1850s technology couldn't remove, and the remote Adirondack location made transportation impossible to sustain. The whole operation was abandoned in 1856, with the village left standing. For the next 45 years, the empty ironworks village was leased to private hunting and fishing clubs, wealthy New Yorkers who found the same wilderness that had bankrupted the mine to be exactly what they wanted in a vacation. One of those clubs was the Tahawus Club, and in 1901, its guest was Vice President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was hiking on Mount Marcy when a messenger reached him with news that President McKinley, shot 8 days earlier in Buffalo, was dying. He came down, climbed into a horse-drawn wagon in the dark, and rode through the Adirondack wilderness, changing horses twice. He learned of McKinley's death somewhere between Tahawus and Minerva and arrived in Buffalo as the 26th President of the United States. 40 years later, the titanium dioxide that had ruined the iron mine became the point. During World War II, titanium was essential for aircraft and paint production, so the federal government funded a railroad into the site, and National Lead Industries moved in, built 84 buildings, and extracted 40 million tons of titanium from what became the largest titanium mine in the world. When operations ended in 1989, the company left. Today, the 1854 blast furnace still stands in the Adirondack forest, and the mine tailings permanently altered the course of the Hudson River. The company rerouted it during operations, and it has never been returned to its original path. Number 12. Agloe, New York. In 1937, 2 mapmakers created a fake town called Agloe and placed it on an official New York road map. The town didn't exist. It was added as a trap, so if another company copied the map, the fake town would appear on their version too, proving the theft. A few years later, the General Drafting Company spotted Agloe on a Rand McNally map of New York, caught them, except Rand McNally's lawyers said county records showed Agloe was a real place because someone had built a store there. An unnamed entrepreneur had found the map in the early 1950s, driven to the spot, found nothing, and decided that since the map said a town was there, people would come looking for one. He opened the Agloe General Store, the county recognized it as a real place, and the copyright case collapsed. Rand McNally hadn't plagiarized anyone because the town their map showed had been made real by the time anyone checked. Over the following decades, Agloe grew to a gas station, the general store, and 2 houses. It appeared on Google Maps, and John Green used it as the destination in his 2009 novel Paper Towns. In 2014, the U.S. Geological Survey officially removed Agloe from its geographic database, ruling it was not a real place. The town that had been invented, then briefly made real by one man's commercial instinct, ceased to exist for the second time. Today there is a sign and a dirt road. The place that was made real by a map and unmade by a different map is whatever the field behind the sign happens to be. Number 11. Doodletown, New York. Before Bear Mountain State Park erased it, Doodletown was a 200-year-old hamlet in Orange County where descendants of Hessian soldiers captured during the Revolutionary War lived alongside Dutch colonial farming families and African American families who had been free in this county since before the Civil War. In the 1960s, New York State offered to buy them out. The offer was technically voluntary. The valley sat at the foot of Bear Mountain along Popolopan Creek, geography that had kept it somewhat separate from the surrounding region, which was exactly why the community had its own character after 200 years, rather than having been absorbed into larger towns. The creation of Bear Mountain State Park gradually isolated Doodletown. Roads closed, services reduced, the economic reason for living there diminished. The state began buying properties from residents who wanted to sell, and by 1965, the last resident was gone. The schoolhouse stood until 1980, when it was demolished after vandalism. The forest has grown back through the building's foundations, and the 30-plus signs the state installed label what each foundation once was. The school, the church, the various houses, the spring, deer moving through what used to be the street. Doodletown is the most thoroughly documented ghost town in the Hudson Valley, which is both the best possible thing and a specific kind of sad. Number 10. Willard, New York. When the Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane closed in 1995 after 126 years on the shores of Seneca Lake, workers found 427 suitcases in an attic. Each one had been packed by a patient when they were admitted, tagged with their name, and stored, never returned because the patient never left. The suitcases contained the things people bring when they believe they are going somewhere temporarily: family photographs, letters, diaries, eyeglasses, professional tools, musical instruments, toys. Among them was a suitcase belonging to a woman who had packed a silk dress, dance shoes, and a photograph of herself as a young woman. Admitted at 32, she died at Willard 43 years later, having brought the things she expected to need again. Willard opened in 1869 to house patients considered too far gone for treatment, people who would be warehoused, not cured. At its peak, it housed over 4,000 patients on 1,500 acres, operating as a complete village with its own post office, fire department, bowling alley, and theater. Patients grew the food, made the furniture, and produced the goods that kept the institution running. They were called chronic, not because their conditions were necessarily untreatable, but because the asylum system had no mechanism for discharge. Under New York state law, well into the 20th century, a person could be committed on the signed statement of two physicians and a family member. No hearing, no lawyer, no right of appeal. Admission was simple paperwork. Release required someone on the outside who cared enough to fight for it. Some patients spent 50 years at Willard. The granite buildings still stand on the Seneca Lake shoreline, designed to be permanent for people who were never supposed to leave. Number 9. The Catskill Reservoir Communities, New York. Between 1905 and 1964, New York City flooded 8 inhabited Catskill mountain valleys to build its reservoir system, displacing more than 2,000 people. The communities of West Shokan, Olive Branch, Shokan, Brown Station, and several others were purchased under eminent domain, the buildings demolished and the valleys filled. In some cases, the cemeteries were relocated. In others, the graves were left under the water. Most New Yorkers who drink from the Catskill system every day have no idea what is at the bottom of it. The Ashokan Reservoir, completed in 1915, was the largest. Homes, farms, churches, stores, mills, all demolished or inundated. The Pepacton followed in 1955, flooding the community of Arena and parts of 4 townships. The Cannonsville Reservoir, completed in 1964, flooded the East Branch Delaware Valley and the town of Cannonsville itself, a 19th century community of farms, a hotel, and a railroad stop the city had targeted since the 1930s. The families fought the takings in court for decades, some receiving prices they considered fair, many not. Some agreements required families to relocate their relatives' graves from the cemetery at their own expense before the water rose. During droughts, when the reservoir levels drop, the remnants emerge. Road surfaces, stone foundations, mill walls. In very dry years, the old street grids become visible through the water, and kayakers follow roads that haven't been driven since 1915. The city that depends on what those valleys became has largely forgotten what they were. Number 8. Lestershire, New York. Here is the strange contradiction at the heart of Lestershire. The company that took over this upstate New York town built free carousels, paid above-market wages, and funded free medical care for its workers, and also fought every union organizing effort for decades on the grounds that its generosity made unions unnecessary. The carousels are still running. The town they were built in no longer exists. Lestershire started in 1890 as a standard company town in Broome County. Anjou manufacturing built it from scratch to houseworkers making bicycles and later shoes, owning every house, every street, and every service. When Endicott Johnson Corporation absorbed it in the early 20th century, George F. Johnson transformed the model. Workers called him the Square Deal Man. He built parks, carousels permanently free to ride, recreational facilities, and free clinics. He also defeated a CIO organizing campaign in the late 1930s by arguing his system was already better than anything a union could win. The shoe factory eventually employed 20,000 workers and became one of the largest shoe manufacturers in the world before it closed. Johnson built the factory to be permanent and the carousels as a gift. The factory is gone. 6 carousels remain, still spinning, maintained by the community that outlasted everything else. Number 7. The drowned hamlets of the Adirondacks, New York. Most people know that New York City flooded Catskill valleys for its reservoirs. Almost nobody knows that throughout the mid-20th century, the state of New York and private power companies quietly flooded a separate set of Adirondack communities, Conifer, Brandreth, Sabatis, and others along the Raquette and Oswegatchie rivers, with almost no documentation, almost no legal challenges, and almost no public awareness that anything was ever there. The Catskill takings were fought in court for decades. The Adirondack displacements happened more quietly because the communities were already isolated and had less access to the legal system that might have slowed things down. Their remoteness, which had been the defining feature of these places, became the reason their displacement attracted almost no attention. And in some cases, the water level decisions that flooded them were partly driven by lobbying from wealthy sporting clubs like the Adirondack League Club, who wanted regulated water levels on the lakes their members used for recreation. Poor and isolated communities were flooded so that wealthy sportsmen could have better fishing. The only way to reach some of these sites today is by canoe or kayak. In drought years, stone walls and bridge abutments emerge from the water, the physical evidence of communities that most New Yorkers have never heard of, in places most New Yorkers have never been. If the stories of the places nobody talks about are why you watch this channel, drop a comment below and tell me what forgotten town in your state deserves to be on this list. Number 6. Phoenicia Area, Tanneries, New York. The tannery towns of the Catskills are the most perfectly self-defeating communities in New York State history, built around an industry that arrived, stripped the forest bare within 20 years, packed up, and moved to the next valley with trees. The entire tannery era in the Catskills lasted about 50 years, from the 1820s to the 1870s. 50 years to consume 4 million hemlocks and erase dozens of communities. The industry built towns specifically to consume the thing that made those towns viable. The process needed hemlock bark, which contains tannin, and the Catskills had hemlock forests of extraordinary density. Operators arrived in the 1820s, built workers' housing, stores, churches, schools, complete communities, and set crews to stripping bark across the surrounding ridges until the stripped trees died and the forests were cleared. An estimated 4 million hemlock trees were consumed in Ulster and Greene counties alone between 1820 and 1860. When a valley's hemlock was gone, the equipment was disassembled, loaded onto wagons, and moved to the next valley with intact forest. The workers followed, the community dissolved and reformed elsewhere, and the stripped hillsides were left behind. Eventually, there was no more Catskill hemlock within reach, and the whole operation moved to Pennsylvania and Michigan. Today, hikers in the Catskills walk through forests that are second and third growth. The trees that look ancient were planted after the Civil War on hillsides that had been stripped clean. Some tannery foundations are still findable in the understory, the physical remains of an industry that was its own ending. Number 5. Fort Hunter, New York. The Erie Canal was abandoned 3 times. The original 1825 canal was superseded by an enlarged version in the 1840s. The enlarged version was superseded by the railroads in the late 19th century. A barge canal version replaced it in the early 20th century, each one replacing what came before. And today at Fort Hunter on the Mohawk River you can see what all 3 left behind. The guard gates, the Waylock building, the canal prism itself, sitting quiet in Montgomery County in a landscape that was once the commercial spine of a continent. The Erie Canal opened in 1825 and transformed North America. It connected the agricultural interior to New York City, dropped freight costs between Buffalo and New York by 95%, and made New York the dominant commercial center of the country within a decade. The Schoharie Crossing at Fort Hunter was one of its most technically demanding sections, carrying the canal over the Schoharie Creek on a stone aqueduct. 3 iterations of the same waterway, each one eventually abandoned. The Waylock building, where boats were weighed to calculate their toll, still stands. The stone guard lock structures are intact along the prism. What was once the commercial spine of New York is now a hiking trail along an empty channel. The most important transportation project in American history is a walk in the woods. Number 4. Natural Dam, New York. In a corner of St. Lawrence County that most New Yorkers have never visited, the Oswegatchie River flows over a limestone shelf that creates one of the only natural dams in the eastern United States, a waterfall roughly 1,000 feet wide at high water, wider than Niagara Falls, that almost no one outside the county knows exists. In the early 1800s, grist mills and sawmills were built to harness it. A hamlet grew to service the mills. And for several decades, Natural Dam was a working community with a clear reason to exist. The mills are long gone and the hamlet has nearly disappeared. The waterfall is exactly as it has always been. When the railroads bypassed the hamlet and small-scale milling became unprofitable, the mills closed and the workers moved to Gouverneur and other towns where the economy had concentrated. Today, Natural Dam is a small cluster of structures around the geological feature that created them. The limestone shelf still produces the same waterfall it has produced for thousands of years. The hamlet that grew up to use it has largely vanished, and what remains is the thing that was there long before anyone arrived and will be there long after everything human is gone. Number 3. Looneyville, New York. Looneyville. That is the actual name of a real place in Chenango County. A hamlet that existed in the early 19th century, served the agricultural community around it, and faded out when the economic patterns of rural New York shifted away from small hamlet commerce. The name has nothing to do with the adjective. It was named for a family called Looney, who were among the early settlers. The Looneys are long gone, and the hamlet named for them has been empty long enough that the family name is now the only trace of them that remains. The hamlets of the Susquehanna watershed followed a pattern set in the early 1800s. A mill, a store, a church, a blacksmith, gathering the production of the surrounding farms and providing the services those farms needed. Nothing about Looneyville was strategically important. It was simply the right size for its moment. When the railroads bypassed the smaller hamlets, consolidated schools replaced one-room schoolhouses, and the automobile made driving to a larger town store easier than supporting a local one, the hamlet's specific usefulness ceased to exist. The people didn't leave dramatically. They gradually shifted their commerce, their children's schooling, and their church attendance elsewhere, and the buildings were repurposed or left to fall. What remains at Looneyville is the name on county maps and a few structures. The people whose grandparents knew it as a distinct place still exist. The distinctness of the place has not survived them. Number 2. Burden Iron Works / South Troy, New York. The Burden Iron Works in South Troy was, for a period in the middle of the Civil War, supplying horseshoes to both armies simultaneously. At its peak, it turned out 60 horseshoes per minute from a machine Henry Burden invented that no other operation in the world could match. The Union cavalry needed them and was supplied. The Confederate cavalry couldn't manufacture their own at scale and depended heavily on what they captured from Union supply lines. A factory on the Winantskill in Troy was a material factor in the cavalry logistics of the entire war. Henry Burden arrived from Scotland in 1819 and built the Troy facility into the most productive ironworks in America by the 1830s. His horseshoe machine, patented in 1835, produced a finished horseshoe from a rod of iron in a single operation at a speed that made individual blacksmiths economically obsolete for military supply. The water wheel he built to power it all, 60 feet in diameter, 22 feet wide, 500 horsepower, was the largest breast wheel in the Western Hemisphere. The works closed in 1940. The brick ruins along the Winantskill and the remains of the water wheel are still there, the ruins of the factory that supplied the cavalry of an entire war on a street that commuters drive past every morning without knowing what they're next to. Number 1. Hagadorn Corners, New York. Hagadorn Corners is a hamlet in Madison County that is precisely as unremarkable as most of the hamlets that make up rural upstate New York. A few houses, a former church building, the road intersection that gave it its name, and the specific quiet of a place that was once a distinct community and is now just a place where two roads meet. It is on this list because every county in upstate New York has something exactly like it, and because the thing that made it a community rather than just a crossroads has been gone long enough that most people who live a mile from it could not tell you what it used to be. It had the things that made a 19th century rural hamlet real: a store, a church, a school, and the informal commerce that happens when people have a regular reason to gather in one place. None of those things required it to be notable. They required it to be useful. The consolidation of rural services in the 20th century made that specific usefulness redundant. The school consolidated, the store closed, the congregation joined another, and without a reason to gather at this particular spot rather than any other, the community dissolved while the intersection remained. What makes Hagadorn Corners worth ending on is not its particular story. That story is not unusual. Every county in upstate New York has multiple versions of it, and this is the shape that most abandoned places here take. Not dramatic, not violent, not the result of a corporation or a government decision, just the quiet consequence of a world that found more efficient ways to organize itself and left these crossroads behind. Comment and tell us what part of upstate New York you're from so we can explore a place near you in the next video.